We have André Wink joining us live from Athens, Greece. André, thank you so much. It's 10 p.m. his time in Athens, and Athens is just waking up, as I understand it. And so we're very pleased to have you tonight joining us, André. André Wink is the Kern Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was educated at the University of Leiden, the Netherlands, where he taught Indian and Islamic history for 8 years before coming to the UW-Madison in 1990, where he taught until 2019. He's the author of numerous books, and most recently, The Making of the Indo-Islamic World on Cambridge Press in 2020. And he is currently in Athens, Greece. So thank you, André, so much for joining us. And you are muted, by the way, so you're going to have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, are you hearing me?
You are on. Good evening.
Okay.
And welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure. And welcome to Athens. I'm very sorry I cannot take you around, but that is because we are in a curfew here, a lockdown with a nightly curfew starting at 9 o'clock. So this will be sort of an introduction to a book that I published in August 2020, a few months ago. I didn't get it until December because of the COVID epidemic and the impaired mail services. So I haven't really looked into it very much, and I haven't been able to talk about it very much yet, but I'm sure there will be many other occasions. It's a great pleasure to start off in this way. The book that I am talking about, Scott, can you show the cover? There was here we go. Yeah, so it's published by Cambridge University Press, and you can find it on Amazon, if not in your local bookstore. It's also available on Kindle. And this is a kind of a short book. It's only about 230 pages. There's also a long version of it. I would like to let you know that, or if you are interested in the subject and you want to read more after this, there's a multi-volume version of the same book, which is still not completely finished. I'm actually working on the final 2 volumes, but 3 others are out, and those are much more detailed than the book that I'm going to introduce to you tonight. It's much more difficult for me, and I understand that most authors feel this way, to write a short book. The problem is, of course, what I'm going to put in and what to leave out. And this is why it took me a great deal of effort to write such a short book on such a big subject. The subject is certainly big. As you can see on the cover, I cover about a millennium of history in it. And so that was really the challenge, to be concise. So let me say a few things to introduce you to the subject. Most people, when they think about the Islamic world or the Muslim world, there is a kind of, for most people, there's a kind of association with the Middle East and the Arabs above all, especially also with Arabia. And this is to a large extent justified. I'm saying this is justified up to a point. After all, this is where the Islamic religion and civilization originated. And the prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was of course an Arab as well. The two most important pilgrimage cities in the Muslim world are also located in Arabia. These are, of course, Mecca and Medina, Medina being actually a more sacred city than Mecca. But anyway, these are very important destinations for annual pilgrimage, though they're not the only ones, there are others, but these are by far the most important. And of course, the the Quran is in Arabic, and for a long time was only available in Arabic. Translations, of course, have been made, but for a long time that was not. These were not available, and it was only available in Arabic. Most of the important theological, legal texts of Islam are actually also written in Arabic, and they are written in the first 3 centuries of Islamic history, mostly. Not all, but certainly the most important ones are written in Arabic in the first 3 centuries. So these first 3 centuries of Islamic history, these were really dominated by the Arabs and the Arabic language. And we call that the formative period of Islam until about 1000 AD, beginning, of course, in the 7th century. So from the 7th century till the late 10th century, we call that the formative stage. Sometimes it's called the golden age. I don't like that terminology nearly as much, because we can also call, for example, later on the 16th century the golden age of Islam, because it reached its maximum political extent at that time. Well, let's call it the formative period of the Islamic world. And this period was dominated by the Arabs. So it's quite understandable that, and I mean justified, that people associate Islam above all with the Arabs, and indeed with Arabia and the Middle East. Now, when we look at the Islamic world later, it is easy to see that the Arabs lose their prominence. After about 1000 AD, the most important people in the Muslim world, in particular the leadership, the political leadership, they are no longer Arabs. So it's over with the Arabs' political importance by then. They recede to the background. So in this book, I refer to the Arab-dominated early Islamic world as the first Islamic world. And I distinguish this first Islamic world from, well, you might guess, the second Islamic world, which is equivalent to the Indo-Islamic world, as used in the title of this book and of many of my books. Let me reveal that this term Indo-Islamic world is not something that you will find throughout the literature. It's something that I use. I believe I actually invented this terminology, more or less. It's not like everybody talks about it in this way, though hopefully they will soon. Now, so the second Islamic world originates later than the first Islamic world of the Arabs. And I would say it is less well known. That does not mean that it is less important. It is important for different reasons. I would say it is actually more important than the first Islamic world if you think in terms of demography or economy. After all, even today, you can say that the majority of Muslim believers, they actually don't live in the Middle East. They live in the countries that I would say came out of this Indo-Islamic world, and basically Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. There are more Muslims there than in the whole of the Middle East. In fact, the majority of the world's Muslims are in this Indic realm. And economically, as you probably are aware, India and China were always, in pre-industrial times, were far more important than the Middle East, which is, after all, very largely made up of desert. So from the point of view of demography and economics, the Indo-Islamic world is of supreme importance, even though it originated a little bit later, largely from the 11th century on. And even though, as we will see in a moment, Islam never became the majority religion in that part of the world. We're talking, yeah, wouldn't mind if you could show us the map by now. Yeah, this is a map that I drew of what I call, the Indo-Islamic world. It's not possible to draw extremely clear boundaries around it, but this is approximately what it is. And if you look at this area today, well, it's very densely populated. There are more than 2 billion people living in the various nation states that have been created out of the colonial empires that were created here from about 1800 on by the English, the French, and the Dutch in particular. And this is the area that I call the Indo-Islamic world up to about 1800. This is also something I would like to stress. After 1800, we get colonial empires, most importantly India, British India, but Dutch Indonesia is also important, particularly important. I don't call that the Indo-Islamic world anymore. That is a different story. I don't speak of the Indo-Islamic world as something that currently exists. In my opinion, it is a designation, or the way I use it, it is a designation for a historical formation up to about 1800. Now, you may be wondering, after I said this, whether there is a third Islamic world, and perhaps even more. Yes, this is a good question. In my opinion, there is actually, yes, there's a third Islamic world, the Greek Islamic world, I would call that. It's the Ottoman Empire with Greece in it. I'm not going to talk about that, but it would be possible to write a similar book about the Greek Islamic world. And that would also start a little bit around the same time, or perhaps a bit earlier. And it goes on until the 19th and 20th centuries, until the Ottoman Empire expires. You could perhaps distinguish even more Islamic worlds, but we are not going to be concerned with the contemporary Islamic world. I wouldn't want to talk about it too much now, because I was told, only 50 minutes. So I will focus on almost entirely on the Indo-Islamic world. I already made it clear probably that this is far more than India, as understood today. Indeed, it starts in eastern Afghanistan, places like Kabul, Kandahar, are, in my opinion, and this is of course something I justify in the book. These are part of India, actually, in the medieval sense of the word. And it runs the border or the boundary line runs through Balochistan. Everything that is now in Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan is part of the Indo-Islamic world. And it moves east, all of India, all of South Asia, and all of the mainland of Southeast Asia, what is now Burma or Myanmar and Thailand and Cambodia, are all part of the Indo-Islamic world, and then the Malay Peninsula, and the vast archipelago of Indonesia. This is, of course, the situation in around 1700 AD. It needs to be kept in mind that this is something that grew over time. Here it is at its maximum size. If you look at it in the year 1000, it would have been much smaller. It would have been only the northwestern parts of this map. So this enormous region, Monsoon Asia, basically, that would be more or less the equivalent, very densely populated today. Some of the most densely populated parts of the world, indeed, Bangladesh, what is here called Bengal, and all of India, and certainly also Indonesia. You may be a bit puzzled by this approach. I'm from the Netherlands originally, though I don't live there. And there it has always been customary to speak of the Indies in Dutch. And basically there are two Indies. One is India, and then there is Indonesia. So this concept of a broad region running from Afghanistan all the way up to the eastern Indonesian Spice Islands, and even including Irian Jaya, which is also really part of the Spice Islands. That is very common in the Netherlands. And the people of the Netherlands have a long association, of course, with this part of the world, but they're right in calling this whole region India, or in my case, the Indo-Islamic world. That is because Indian culture has been spread throughout this region for centuries. The Hinduism or Indian religion of South Asia is really not different in essence from the Hinduism of, say, Java. There are differences, but it's clearly part of the same Indian culture. And so there are many other reasons why we speak of this whole region as India and the Indianized territories. It is a scholarly challenge to study this. And why is that? Well, because after about the 10th century, or starting a little earlier in the Northwest, it's really a hybrid civilization in a sense, Indian and Islamic. In due course, this region would contain the largest number of Muslims in the world, but it still was a minority religion until the end. So even though the numbers of Muslims living in the Indo-Islamic world are enormous, yet they are a minority. If you look at the whole population, the majority of people in this region have never converted to Islam. Islam was for a long time a political imperial religion in many parts of this area. But the Islamic conquest of India has never been complete in any sense of the word. That is the most important thing to understand. And this makes it a real challenge to study. And most people who study the Islamic world are sometimes confused when they enter this region, and they don't know what to do with it because it's not Islamic and it's not Indian, it's a combination of the two things. And this can create all kinds of cognitive problems. This is also the reason, one of the reasons I felt interested in it. When I was an undergraduate in the Netherlands, quite a long time ago, I always felt that I couldn't understand this region at all. It was the most difficult to understand for me because the teachers that I had, which were all excellent in my opinion, they focused on one or the other. They were either interested in the Indian, usually the ancient Indian culture, and studying Sanskrit and other languages, Indian origin, or they were interested in the Islamic culture, and then they didn't know how to deal with the non-Islamic parts. So this was a kind of an epistemological challenge that I felt from the beginning required a different approach than people usually had. I was quite interested in, but also quite unsatisfied with the way it was studied. In a way, what I thought and what I still think is that you can compare the history of the Indo-Islamic world with what happened in the Mediterranean and in parts of the Near East in late antiquity. In the ancient Roman and Greek world, there was a crossover to the monotheistic tradition at some point, mostly in late antiquity. It's a complicated long-term process. The switchover, the crossover from paganism to the monotheistic tradition of Christianity first, and then in some parts, Islam. So from pagan, local, polytheistic traditions, there was a change over to revealed religion. And this is a process that is, of course, studied much more. People have been studying this for a very long time. As you may know, late antiquity has become something of a booming industry ever since the term was made popular by Peter Brown. He didn't invent the term, I don't think, but in the 70s and before that, he called special attention to this period of late antiquity as something that can be studied in positive terms, not as just the decline of the ancient world. This was a big success. There have been lots of people studying late antiquity. And in my view, we who study, who study this Indo-Islamic world, are in some respects studying something quite similar as what people have been looking at in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East in late antiquity. I actually even think that the late antiquity students and scholars can learn a few things from studying the Indo-Islamic world, particularly what it means to convert from a pagan tradition to Islam or to Christianity. We can clearly see that, for example, in the 17th and 18th centuries in parts of Indonesia, whereas in the Middle East, it happened a very long time ago, and it's much more difficult to reconstruct. But there are some similarities here, and it's a very important world historical transformation of a similar kind. The difference is, of course, that in the Indo-Islamic world, this process of crossing over to the monotheistic tradition has never been completed. And in a way, it is still going on. Or you can also say that it was actually aborted during the colonial era. It's hard to speculate what would have happened if the British and the Dutch had not colonized and politically dominated these areas. But it is a process that never was completed. And that is one of the interesting things about it. In the Middle East, the transition from Greek and Roman pagan culture to Christianity and Islam was much more complete, although we should not exaggerate that either. We have heard about all kinds of pagan sects in the Middle East in recent times, for example, the Zaydis. And there are many, I actually said sects, not sects. Yeah, this is a transition. So, yeah, but in any case, in the Middle East, we have a much more complete transition to monotheism than in the Indo-Islamic world. It's hard to say what would have happened without colonialism. And what's happening today is not nice at all. We see arms. There was an arms race, of course, between Pakistan and India, and there's enormous religious tension in these areas. I am not going to focus on that. That would be, again, taking up too much time. Instead, I'll be focusing on the early period. The period which is about a millennium of Indo-Islamic history from around 700 to 1800 CE. In the course of my research, which I've been doing for a long time, it's sort of 4 decades, more than 4 decades of research off and on. Not that I've been doing this all the time and every day, but it is certainly spread out over 4 decades. And that doesn't mean that my conclusions are necessarily flawless or always correct, but I have come to a number of major conclusions that I stand by, and that can be criticized perhaps, but I personally am very committed to them. Before I mention what those conclusions are, and they're all quite simple, although they may surprise the readers of this book, and therefore you as well, let me say a few words about the so-called methodology that I try to follow. I have always tried to go beyond the purely textual evidence. We have a lot of textual evidence, both Indian and Islamic, both Indological and Islamological. Not all of it translated, I might add. Although a lot of it, no, not all of it, but there's some of it is translated, others, much of it is not. These textual traditions are quite interesting, and I don't think you could study this area without them. But I do think that by themselves, they are not enough to reconstruct the history of this area. Some of the major figures, rulers of this Indo-Islamic world, as I define it, were in fact illiterate. And that is something that always struck me as important. If there are people who are very big, very important in the creation of the Indo-Islamic world, who are illiterate, that seems to be an indication that texts are not necessarily the only key to this area. Who are these people that are illiterate and are very important? Well, Timur is one of them. You may have heard of Timur Lane, the 14th and early 15th century Turkish or Turco-Mongol conqueror, whose reputation is very much comparable to that of Genghis Khan. And indeed, operas have been written about him in Europe. He's an Indo-Islamic ruler, and he's indeed one of the key figures in the history of the Indo-Islamic world, who was illiterate. Akbar in the 16th century, he is popular. Most people think that what we need today is another Akbar, because he brought the Hindu and Muslim communities together. He also was illiterate. He ruled in the 16th century. He's often considered one of the great rulers of the Mughal dynasty, and indeed one of the great rulers of the early modern world, and illiterate. The third one you may not know, although he is an interesting figure, Hyder Ali in Mysore, South India, a very important and militant Islamic ruler who was also illiterate. Now, so I'm not skeptical about literacy or text, either Indological or Islamological. I've studied probably millions of, maybe hundreds of thousands of them. But my approach wants to go beyond texts solely. And I've tried to root my approach in, for example, geography, and also in environmental studies, even climate studies, historical anthropology, for example, also, and of course, archaeology. And above all, what I always find very interesting and important, indispensable, in fact, the so-called natural archive. Bioarchaeology, for example, or the history of disease. These are quite fashionable subjects, as you will readily admit, and as I also admit. I think that in the future, it will be more and more common that the sciences and the humanities will work together, and the results, I think, are going to be revolutionary. It will indeed change our view of history, but this has already begun, and I've through this to try to sort of set the parameters for this kind of study for the Indo-Islamic world. There are other works that, for example, have been written quite some time earlier about better known areas such as the Mediterranean. I would, for example, well, maybe you've seen the book by Karl Harper, The Fate of Rome. This is a typical example of what I'm referring to. It combines the history or the sciences with the humanities. And it indeed shows a new light on, the history of Rome and even some even though that history is extremely well known by comparison to my area. But even late antiquity looks completely different if you consider the material that is brought up by, for example, somebody like Karl Harper in his book, The Fate of Rome. So I'm particularly interested in bringing together scientific material, archaeological material with the texts. And I think that this is what was really needed in this area. Nobody has done that, as far as I know. And this was the great problem, that it was not rooted. The field was not adequately rooted in geography and the so-called natural archive that is quite rich. And I do think that in the future, many more detailed studies can be produced, starting from this premise that this is where a lot of new material and new conclusions can be arrived at. Well, the study of text tends to become somewhat sterile if it is disembodied from this environmental and geographical context. At least this is my conclusion. Okay, so now let me briefly go through the conclusions that I have drawn. How much more time can I take, Scott?
You can take as much time as you'd like.
I won't take.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe 20 minutes. I'll try to speed up a little.
Sure.
So the first first conclusion is this. In the Indo-Islamic world, we do not have ancient cities. Very little urbanism, and the urbanism that we have was very unstable. We also do not have ancient empires in this area. That sets it apart from the Middle East in a really big way. Many people react to this statement with a disbelief, even shock, not to say animosity. I thoroughly believe this, though. There was no ancient imperial heritage here comparable to the Middle East or the Mediterranean, and no urban life. And the reason for that is that it was much more environmentally unstable. What is important in India are vast alluvial river plains that are flat. And the enormous water masses of these major rivers, they shift their courses all the time, and they destroyed innumerable cities. So the unstable environment is responsible for the lack of a continuous urban tradition. I regard monsoon Asia as the most unstable environment on the planet. I don't mean to suggest that other parts of the planet are stable, not at all. There is no such thing as a stable environment, but it's a matter of degree. The monsoon areas were hydrologically unstable to a very high degree. This is a huge difference with the urbanized world, the Mediterranean and the Near East, where urbanism and ancient empires are absolutely central. The environmental instability in this area, as I said, is primarily hydrological, huge shifting water masses everywhere during and after the monsoon, enormous rivers that change their courses all the time over enormous distances. But there are many other forms of climatological and meteorological and even seismic instability that add to this. Earthquakes and volcanoes, particularly in Indonesia, create other forms of instability. There are many recent examples of such instability. You may remember the tsunami of 2004, a sub-oceanic earthquake to the west of Sumatra created a huge disaster all around the Bay of Bengal. In 2005, to mention just one more, was an enormous earthquake in the Karakoram in Baltistan, northern Pakistan, which has always been very prone to seismic shifts. This area killed at least 80,000 people. These are just recent examples, but historically this has been going on for as long as we can retrace the history. This is why I call the Indo-Islamic world, or India, a graveyard of cities. You see on the cover of my book, you see a picture of Varanasi, which is sometimes called an ancient city. Wouldn't that be a contradiction of what I just said? Yes and no. I describe this city of Varanasi, the sacred city of the Hindus, as an exception. It's built on a kind of hard rock, a kind of clay that is sometimes found in the alluvium, very rarely though. And this is the reason that it was built on this site. It's built on kankar, a hard form of clay, almost rock, that is exceptional in the alluvium. Moreover, everything you see in this picture is 16th century or later. There is no such thing as an ancient city here. The earliest foundations, the earliest art in Varanasi is possibly 5th century AD. Nothing like what I see, for example, but nothing ancient in the European sense. Yeah, so most of the cities in India and the Indo-Islamic world were not even cities. They were more like big villages. I call them urban centers, rural urban. And they were not really built of stone either. They were usually built of perishable materials, like, for example, the residential quarters of the Nile area in Egypt. What was built in stone was usually only temples, monumental temples, but cities were perishable and could be destroyed and abandoned very quickly, and they often were. So we don't have continuous urban tradition going back to ancient times. That is my first conclusion. And we do not really have empires based on cities in ancient times. This is another thing that people often find hard to believe, because they've all been told in school, in India, for example, about ancient Indian empires like Ashoka and the Mauryas. In my opinion, these were not really empires. They were more like ritual, say, centers of sovereignty, but they were not empires in the sense that Rome or Persia was an empire. Okay, I will be happy to elaborate on that, but in my opinion, empires did not exist in ancient India, however much people wished they had. It is one of the ideas of nationalism that there were such empires. It's sort of like considered desirable all of a sudden. And this is a bit odd because most nationalists are against empires, but not when they look at their ancient past. So this desire to have empires in your ancient past and be like Europeans, therefore, like the Greeks and Romans, that has essentially produced this fallacious idea that there were ancient Indian empires. Okay, that is the first thesis. The result is that the Indo-Islamic world was much less urban than the Middle Eastern Muslim world. much less textual oriented, therefore, much less urban, and much more based on customary law, and indeed infused with rural and Indian traditions. And this was the case certainly up to 1800, and even I would say today it is much more the case than in the Middle East. That is the first conclusion. Now let me move on to the second. I conceive of India as a rural civilization that developed largely in medieval times, not in ancient times. This has ruffled quite a few feathers in the past, this idea, because classical Indology has always been interested in ancient texts. And there are ancient texts. I don't deny that they exist, the Vedas, for example. But and I do think classical Indology is a venerable discipline, a difficult field, with many practitioners that are really doing excellent work. And they're quite right pointing out that the origins of civilization are indeed ancient. They go back to the second millennium BC, the origins. But I still maintain that Indian civilization, as we know it today, is not an ancient civilization, really. It is a medieval civilization. So, for example, the Indian caste system, yes, it is certainly true that this is mentioned in ancient texts once or twice. It is mentioned in the Veda once. Caste. What could be more Indian than that? But the actual growth and consolidation of the caste system, as we call it, the hierarchical social ordering based on hereditary divisions that we find in India even today, it does not occur, this does not occur in the ancient time, it occurs in the medieval time. It starts more or less in the 5th century AD, when settled life becomes more and more important. So I would say forget about India as an ancient civilization. Think of it as a medieval civilization. The growth of agriculture is responsible for this. Without agriculture, no civilization. And it was very difficult to bring monsoon India under cultivation because it was so wet. And to clear the forest in this area was very difficult and a very slow process. That's one reason why the agricultural settlement and village agriculture spread far more slowly in India than it did in the softer soils in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. With, of course, the exception of the area of the Indus, which is essentially an extension of the Middle East. There you did have, well, earlier agriculture. But in most of monsoon Asia, it took a long time, an enormous effort to just clear the forests. And it took a long time for agriculture to spread. So settled monarchies and empires emerged only really in the Middle Ages. The 5th century, 7th century, 8th and 9th century in particular. This is a very important fact that I think very few people are aware of, even people who go to India or Indonesia. They may not know this. If I'm walking around in Athens a lot, we are still allowed out in the daytime. And so my itinerary every day is usually around the Acropolis. That's a 5th century BC cluster of buildings. And the most important one, the Parthenon Temple, which is always under repair, but is still there. You don't have that in India. You have such temples. You have monumental stone temples in India, but they don't date back to antiquity. They are only built in the Middle Ages and later. Hindu temples, monumental Hindu temples, often very large. The largest is in fact in Cambodia. You've maybe heard of Angkor Wat. That is a Hindu temple. It's not ancient, it's medieval, 12th, 13th centuries AD. So it's very late by comparison to Greece. I don't say that to show how backward the Indians were. I'm only saying that because the ecological circumstances were so different here that it took a very long time for settled life to spread. It was much more difficult. Also because of the disease situation. Indian population grew much more slowly in part because of the endemic disease situation. So from the point of view of world historical comparison, we can say that monsoon Asia was settled, agriculturally settled, relatively late by comparison to, for example, the Middle East or Greece. That is a second conclusion. But it always remained rural. The great monumental temples, in fact, are very often in rural surroundings. And it's not for nothing that the most sacred animal in India is the cow. Okay, so that's the second thing. And now I come to the maybe the last thing I'm going to talk about at some length, 5 minutes. Third conclusion, and the main thesis of this book, that the driving force of Indo-Islamic history are not cities. There weren't really any important cities. The driving force of Indo-Islamic history is the changing relationship between the settled rural populations of the river plains of monsoon Asia and mobile populations. The changing relationship in medieval times between the settled peasant societies of India and the mobile populations in the so-called Great Arid Zone and in the Indian Ocean, where we have seafaring populations. The relationship between settled and mobile peoples changed dramatically. That is the main thing that happened in this millennium. Basically, it is the detailed analysis of that this book is about. So I do not distinguish, from a geographic point of view, I do not distinguish sea from land. That is certainly another option. And the Bible, indeed, in the first book, it speaks of land and sea. I don't speak of land and sea as the most fundamental geographical distinction. To me, the most fundamental distinction is between settled life and mobile populations. Settled peasants on the one hand, in great numbers, enormous numbers in these river plains, starting in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. And then on the other hand, unsettled people, the nomads in particular of Eurasia, these are extremely important historically in the history of Asia, in the history of India and the history of China as well, and in the history of the Middle East. So the nomadic frontier. And next to that, we have the maritime frontier, which is very similar because the people who live there are dependent on movement. Trade and fishing, raiding, all their activities are dependent on movement. The problem that an historian encounters studying these people is that they are, of course, considered the barbarians by all the civilized, settled people. Civilized people are always settled people, and people who move around are not considered civilized. So the nomads and the maritime populations always get a very bad press from the authors in all settled civilizations. In legal literature and in religious literature, they are considered barbarians, an impure element, and certainly dangerous, disruptive. But this is why it's difficult. It is a special challenge to reconstruct this history, because the people that are really the movers and the shakers, shall we say, of Indo-Islamic history are mobile populations that are described as barbarians, mostly, by the authors of the settled cultures. But in my view, these are the people that are really responsible for the dynamism in this area, not cities. So geography is really destiny in this sense. The whole book is essentially an attempt to show how geography is destiny, and how the shift in the balance between different population groups in different ecological habitats occurred in this millennium, and how that worked itself out in the history of the Indo-Islamic world. So the main question I had to answer was, why does this happen? Why do these mobile populations become so much more powerful and more important? So powerful that they can impose their domination over very old settled populations from, well, all the way from North India to Indonesia. Why does that happen? And why does it happen in medieval times? Why does it not happen earlier or later? And to explain that, that is really the task of the book. And I think I found the reasons why that happened. One has to do with medieval warming. You may have heard about the so-called medieval climate anomaly. The medieval warming period is a very important factor that created, to some extent, or that was the driving force behind the movement of nomads, including the most notorious movements by Genghis Khan. But from about the 11th century on, it is obvious that the steppe lands are pushing people out into the different surrounding areas because they're drying out. The climate has changed, and grasslands are very sensitive to even a little bit of climate change, and horses have to find greener pastures. So the medieval warming period is a very important factor that I used to explain why this Indo-Islamic world is being created by these mobile populations from the Eurasian steppes. It's not only the climate that is important. There were also very important military and technological transitions going on. For example, the invention of the stirrup, which made horse warfare much more formidable, and also the invention of things like the crossbow, or not crossbow, but the compound bow. So development in technology, military technology, made the steppe people more powerful than they were in ancient times. And they also started to develop more centralized polities at the time. The Turks were the first to do so in about the 5th century. But there's a whole package of factors in this way that that explain the movement of mobile populations into older areas of settled agricultural life that were Indianized. Even maritime movements from, for example, Southern Arabia occurred in the Middle Ages under the impact of droughts and temperature changes, climate change. But it's a form of climate change that is not man-made, but it certainly occurs. There are many other such periods in which the climate has changed. There are other factors than human intervention, such as sometimes called solar and orbital forcing. They have to do with the amount of heat that the sun produces and variations in that, and also the changes in the orbit of the Earth, orbital forcing it is sometimes called, that can change the temperature, and it has in the Middle Ages, for example. It also was similar or comparable, perhaps, in the heyday of Roman imperial power in the 2nd century, sometimes called the Roman climate optimum, followed by unstable weather patterns and climate change that were one factor in the decline of the Roman Empire. So this is very important to understand, that these mobile populations impose their political domination on enormous populations, Indian populations in the alluvial plains. And this is where Islam comes in, because Islam is the culture and religion of these mobile populations. That's all you need to remember from what I say tonight. The nomads and the maritime populations, these frontier people, they adopted Islam, which is a religion of mobility. You can take it along. And so that is how Islam came into the Indic world. It was a religion of nomadic, or what we call post-nomadic ruling elites coming from Central Asia. Horse warriors, who also created a horse warrior revolution. And maritime states that are beyond the pale of the Indian caste system. This is where Islam settled in the Indo-Islamic world. One more thing is this, that I do not think that there was much conversion in Hindu India to Islam. In my view, it's very simple. It's clear that the settled societies of the Indian river plains had adopted a hierarchical social order, Hindu order, we call it caste for simplicity's sake. And these were highly resistant to conversion to anything else. And they did not convert to Islam, except when these social formations were destroyed first. So there was no conversion to Islam among settled Hindu peasantries ever, except in those areas that were comprehensively destroyed. And there is only one such area, really. That is the Northwest, the area that is now Pakistan. Why is that a Muslim country today? Well, the reason is that for about 2 centuries in the Middle Ages, Hindu culture was destroyed here by, well, Genghis Khan and his offspring, nomadic people that turned this whole area into an extension of Central Asia and destroyed the sedentary civilization. It's for the same reason that much of Turkey has become Muslim. The Byzantine infrastructure was destroyed over several centuries when Turkish nomads came in and comprehensively raided this area for for hundreds of years. So the settled life and the settled civilization was first destroyed. And then you see the spread of Islam, mass conversion, if you will, among the peasants. This is not normally happening in stable peasant societies. Sometimes it happened that people were enslaved. It's actually quite often the case during military encounters in the centuries of Islamic conquest. And there are lots of people who were uprooted, therefore. And there too, we find a fair amount of, well, conversion, whether forced or semi-forced or whatever you want to call it. So my point is that Islam in the Indo-Islamic world is a religion of mobile groups, be they nomads or maritime people, or even maritime nomads, who establish control over settled societies that are not Muslim and do not convert to Islam, and who remain the majority of the population, except in those areas that were comprehensively destroyed by nomadic invaders in the Middle Ages. And that is essentially how Pakistan became a Muslim country. There's also conversion to Islam in areas that were never Hinduized. I consider, for example, Java such an area. Here we have Hinduism, but it is much more focused on the royal courts. Much of the countryside was still, not Hinduized much. And there we have in due course some slow transformation that we may call conversion to Islam. But in areas that were seriously Hinduized and that had established caste hierarchies, we do not find conversion to Islam. So this goes on until about 1800. And more scriptural forms of Islam and reform movements that that change the situation are actually only occurring here in the 19th century and later. Until then, we find that the Islamic civilization of India is in many ways infused with customary laws and often quasi-polytheistic traditions that come out of India. And they do not have the same character in many ways as the more literal urban traditions of the Near East. This is the situation up to about 1800. In the 19th century, with the spread of books and printed books and so on, we get a completely different story, but not until about 1800. So what remains essentially the case is that the relationship between Islamic populations and Hindu populations, or what I would say, the fundamental process of the millennium of history in the Indo-Islamic world has to do with this kind of people, not with what we think of Muslim civilization today. It has actually quite little to do with it very often. This is one reason why I'm often a bit skeptical about literary approaches to the Indo-Islamic world, because the most important people are not often literate, and literacy doesn't play such a big role as in the Middle East. Well, perhaps I should stop here. I think I've already talked for an hour and 10 minutes. We still have time for questions, I would hope.
Thank you, Andre. And yes, we've got plenty of time for questions. And do want to invite people to submit their questions through chat, and we can help bring you on and ask the question. And Donald Cohen, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself there if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, in the progression of the Muslim religion through Indonesia. After it gets to Java, it skips Bali before Lombok and the further spread to the Spice Islands. And I wonder why Bali still remains Hindu.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. In Bali, we even have today a Hindu tradition that is still alive. And one of the reasons for that is that the 14th and 15th century Hindu dynasty of Java, the last Hindu dynasty of Java, in fact, of Majapahit, escaped to Bali. And this is one reason why Hindu culture has remained more powerful in Bali. When Java was gradually conquered by coastal Muslim maritime cities, this last Hindu dynasty of Majapahit just escaped to the neighboring islands of Bali, where it is still found today. In fact, there are people who still call themselves the Wong Majapahit, which is to say, we are the people of Majapahit, the last Hindu kingdom of Java. So they still have caste, and no other island in Indonesia has that. Bali was a unique island in many ways. The Dutch conquered it in 1905, and it was a notorious event in Dutch colonial history, which is full of notorious events, of course. The entire royal family committed suicide on the beach. This was the so-called Puputan. And even children were gunned down in this encounter. The Dutch wanted to conquer the outer islands because of, well, for many reasons. One is that the Balinese were also notorious slave raiders, especially on the east coast of Java. Bali still had many Hindu practices, such as the equally notorious practice of Hindu immolation, which is also known from India. There it is known as sati, but Hindu burning was going on in Bali, and in the Dutch literature on 19th and 20th century, early 20th century Bali. This is one of the things that they always single out as a social evil that can no longer be tolerated. So that was one of the colonial justifications for the conquest of Bali. But it remained, wedded to Hinduism, and you still have these great funerals there that draw a lot of tourists. It's one reason why Bali is very much a tourist attraction. It has a more permissive culture than the Muslim islands. Is that an answer?
Actually, he's unmuted, or he's on mute right now, so I apologize, but I think you did get.
Oh, okay.
So we do have another.
It's difficult for me.
Yeah, we have another question. Theodore Ornoy Centerwall, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question. There you go.
Yeah, Professor Wink. My question has to do with India itself. I'm somewhat familiar with it, and I lived there for a few years when I was growing up. And one of the things I became very aware of is that in large parts of central or southern India, there are majority villages which are Muslim. And this is not uncommon. In fact, I think it's said somewhere that India itself has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. So I'm wondering why that is, if the central and southern India really weren't subjected to Islamic culture the way the Northwest was.
Well, there are 180 million Muslims in India today, more or less, or maybe a bit more now. And yeah, there are quite a few in the south. There are many different strands of Muslims. There are, for example, the coastal populations, which have always been important. And then there are those who migrated from the north, either from the Deccan Plateau or from further north. And then there are the local converts, whether they are converts by choice or whatever, or whether they are descendants of displaced populations that were basically moved around in these conquest movements. That is very difficult to say. But in the meantime, they have become quite large. So the origins vary. They can be either of these three, either from the coastal communities, or immigrants, or converts, or people who were uprooted by Muslim conquerors and were enslaved. There were quite a large number of those. And in the course of time, they must have been multiplying to many millions. And then there's also conversion by choice. Let's not forget that. I mean, I don't mean to rule that out completely. Islamic Sufis and saints did have certain success in converting often marginal groups in Hindu society, or there was intermarriage. That is also an option. But by and large, I would say established Hindu communities were greatly resistant to conversion, as they are today.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the answer.
We have another question. Richard Horowitz, if I'm gonna get you to unmute yourself. All right, you should be able to unmute now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
From a phone connection, I think. So I had a question about a lot of the Southeast Asian countries are heavily Buddhist now. So when and how did Buddhism come into the picture in that part of the world?
Right. In my opinion, the kind of Buddhism that we today find in mainland Southeast Asia originates from about the 12th and 13th centuries, when it became a peasant religion, very similar to what we find in Sri Lanka. So this is not ancient Indian Buddhism, which was much more a monastic tradition and a much more elitist intellectual tradition, but this is a kind of peasant Buddhism. Indeed, the peasantries of Cambodia and Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka are Theravada Buddhist. And this is a sort of what I would call Hinduized Buddhism. It has a social structure which is quite strong. It has a certain community orientation. And it is not a sort of renunciation tradition. It's not a monastic tradition very much, although there are monasteries in Southeast Asia. But very often we find that, for example, lay people can enter the monasteries for some time and then get out of it again. So the monasteries are very much integrated in a kind of community religion, which is Buddhist, but it's very different from ancient Indian Buddhism, which was not community oriented at all. And this is one reason why it disappeared in India, well, in South Asia. It was simply too elitist.
I think also there's a historical connection. I think Hinduism and Buddhism are historically related religions, like Islam is related to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Is that also correct?
Yeah, Hinduism and Buddhism are often presented to us as very much opposed. And I don't think that that is useful if you look at it in Southeast Asia. No, it is a kind of Hinduized Buddhism, and I wouldn't be able to distinguish the elements which are Hindu and Buddhist analytically very clearly. This is all very nice if you're interested in the history of religion, but this is really a very big confused mixture of all kinds of things. So I don't distinguish them very clearly. They are useful community-oriented traditions that work for peasants, and they're not an academic monastic tradition. That is the main thing. And this kind of Buddhism is rural in orientation, and it spread basically, I would say, from about the 13th century in Southeast Asia and a bit earlier in Sri Lanka. I do deal with the issue of Buddhism in the book. It's a very important problem. I feel that it doesn't have to confuse anyone, but historians of Buddhism are often not interested in reality, as I would call it. They're not interested in history, they're interested in Buddhism as a religion of, high ideals, which is understandable, but the history of Buddhism is therefore sometimes unnecessarily complicated, or let's say misunderstood.
And Andre, I got a question for you. Essentially, we've had a few side conversations along the way, getting you up and running here for your presentation. We thank you very much for this. And we've put the link to your book on Amazon in the chat for anybody that's interested there. But I've had the great responsibility this year with these speaker series events to have so many different people who share their life passion with us in these presentations. And I'm just curious if you could let us know how this became your passion, how this topic, and we talked a little bit about where you were born and some of that, but if you would share a little bit about that with everybody.
Yeah, I don't normally talk about that, but if you ask, I don't mind. I am probably one of the last colonial historians, which in the sense that I was still born in Indonesia and grew up there partly. So for better or worse, there are not many people left who were born in the Dutch Indonesia. Don't forget that Indonesia became independent in 1947 or 1949, but some part of the East remained under Dutch control until 1963. And so my parents were doctors there, and I was born there. And when we went back to the Netherlands, I lived in Leiden, which was full of people like us who had been repatriated, as it were. And we were the last Dutch people in that area after several hundreds of years. Not very popular, by the way. There was a nationalist movement that was quite hostile to the Dutch by that time. And we had to fly back to the Philippines, but were not able to land in Jakarta, for example. That was how much hostility there was with Sukarno, who was very much hated by the Netherlands, or those people who represented the Netherlands, and who was considered a sort of local Hitler. He was certainly an admirer of Hitler sometime, but in any case, he thought that the Dutch were very ill-advised to resist Indonesian nationalism, as indeed they were. They should never have. There were two wars in the last 2 years of Dutch rule there. They are not called wars, they're called police actions, as if it was a domestic affair. And this was a very bad idea. The English described it correctly as a Dutch madness. To hold on to these colonies was no longer a good idea, if it ever was a good idea. And the British, say whatever you like about the British, they were relatively good decolonizers. They left Indonesia without too much resistance, whereas the Dutch did not, and neither did the French. One of the reasons for that is that there were far more settled Dutch people, European people in Indonesia and in Indochina than in India. And once you have European settlement, it is apparently one of the reasons that these colonies were not given up so easily. So this is part of my own history. And when I came back to Leiden, this was, in a way, all that people talked about. And I never thought about any other issue, really. So ancient history and Indo-Islamic history were, for me, the two fields of history that interested me the most. Though later, when I lived in the United States, I, of course, became interested also in American history. But for us, this was like a home territory. And I'm not saying that Dutch colonialism was in any way justified or whatever. I'm just saying that, I don't want to hide my own origins. This is how it came about. So I really grew up in these coastal societies in East Indonesia that my book deals with. And the first language we spoke was Malay, not Dutch or English. So this is one reason I'm living in Greece. It's much warmer here, and I'm used to the warm weather. Anyway, how much more personal do you want me to be?
Well, I think you did well, and really appreciate this presentation. And again, want to thank Julia Sherman for helping bring you to our program as well. And thank you so much for hosting from Athens, Greece, a first for us as well. So do you have any other parting thoughts or words for our audience?
No, I thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to do a Zoom conference. I prefer to do a live conference, but it seems to me that this is a viable option, even though you have to get used to it. And we don't have any choice. So I enjoyed it. And thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
The Amazon website says that there's only 13 copies left. That's not true. That's just standard procedure. In case you want to buy more.
You should have had them gobble them up. Tell them there's only 13 left. There you go. Well, thank you again. Thank you again so much for your time, and you're welcome back anytime. There's been so many rich side conversations we've had that I know our audience would love to learn more from you. So thank you again so much. Thanks to everybody from the OSHER program here in Tucson and around the country for joining us. And everybody have a great week at Ollie, and we'll see you again on Monday. Take care, and thank you again, Andre.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.